They met on the edge of winter, when the city felt like it was holding its breath. The streets were slick with rain that refused to become snow, and the lights of cafes threw soft rectangles onto wet sidewalks. In a small bookstore cafe on the corner of Ash and Linden, among stacks of paperbacks and the warm hiss of espresso, four lives were already crooked by their pasts, about to intersect. Daniel worked as a freelance illustrator, quiet and generous, the kind of man whose laughter arrived like a surprise. He'd loved once with the reckless certainty of someone who trusted people until proven otherwise. Nina, the woman who had been his first true love, had proved otherwise. She had taken more than his heart, savings intended for a studio, a joint lease, the last shred of certainty he'd had. She left with a man from their building in a taxi at dawn, leaving a note with an explanation that read like a promise she never kept. Daniel's trust cracked into careful pieces. He moved back in with his mother for a while. He sold paintings to cover debts. He learned to be cautious. Sophia came with sharper edges. She had been hurt by Leo, who promised the world, and left with the receipts of every kindness she'd ever offered. Leo had been an ambitious, charming man who made her believe in plans and futures. He had a way of making his absence sound like fate. He left Sophia with unpaid rent, a tarnished reputation in a small circle that mattered for jobs, and a debt to a predatory lender who didn't care about reasons. Sophia was not the same as Daniel. She smelled of practicality and the slight bitterness of someone who had learned survival the hard way. She vowed not to be left helpless again. Their first meeting was accidental. Daniel, hauling a portfolio through the rain, slipped in front of the shop and sent his sketches fluttering like oversized confetti. Sophia, who had been inside arguing politely with a barista about the last almond croissant, stepped out to help. She had hands that could move quickly and a patience sharpened by necessity. She bent with him, gathering sheets, smoothing a gouache that had nearly torn. He muttered a cautious thanks. She shrugged and said, "You draw good lungs," which made him laugh, the sound startling, incomplete, and then whole. They began with small conversations that stretched and warmed. Daniel liked the way Sophia described people in clinical, funny sentences. "He takes his sorrow to the gym," she said of a man who trained too hard. She liked his soft bewilderment at the world. He admired how she could name a problem and begin dismantling it. They shared food, they walked in the residual damp after rain, and they started to exchange parts of themselves that had not been bartered away. Sophia told him about Leo in fragments, leases signed with too many names, a dead-end contract, friends who had slowly distanced themselves. Daniel told her about Nina, the way she had left his savings for their studio in a drawer, the hurried note in lipstick. Both carried the hollow ache of betrayal, both found in the other something like repair. They moved slowly, trust had to be coaxed, and both were willing. At first, their love was a cautious bloom. Daniel watched Sophia with devotion that made his friends murmur with approval. He was the sort of lover who left notes folded into coat pockets and served tea precisely how she liked it. Sophia, in turn, let herself be seen in fissures, practiced a version of softness that made Daniel's anxious heart feel safer. For a while, it was honest, but Sophia had a ledger beneath her care. When you survive by counting every consequence, you become adept at weighing people for their usefulness. That ledger, kept small and tidy in a notebook no one saw, was where Sophia measured debts and opportunities, and the things she would do to erase the latter. Meanwhile, Leo, smug, brilliant at distance, drifted through the background as a cautionary tale. He thrived on movement, new clients, new lovers, a new job every other year. He had introduced Sophia to trust and then torn it away with the same casualness he applied to everything, a casual promise, a missed rent payment, an apology dressed as inevitability. He had vanished into a corporate role that paid well and demanded little loyalty beyond productivity. He showed up twice in Sophia's life afterward, once to apologize with the grave charm of a man who thought remorse transactional, and once more to remind her of what she had been without the safety of money. Those reminders hardened her. Sophia's motives, when they first emerged, were practical on the surface. Her bills were real. The debt collector who left notes under her door was real. She needed more than affection, she needed financial oxygen. But motives evolve when someone is pressed against a hard surface too long. The idea that money could buy freedom, freedom from late notices, from sleeping with one eye open, bloomed into something that looked like a plan. The plan used the softest place she could find, Daniel's capacity to love and forgive. At first, the methods were tiny and almost accidental. Sophia encouraged Daniel to move his professional life into more private, lucrative commissions, portraits, commercial illustration. "You can still do your series later," she would say, smoothing his hair, as if prioritizing sales now was an act of love. He believed her because she framed his art as commodity without stripping it of its soul. They shared accounts for a while with the innocence of couples who trust, and in the shared expenses the first transfers moved. Small sums. A dinner here, a deposit there. She wrote little notes to herself in that same notebook about when to ask for larger help, about how to phrase need without seeming needy. The betrayal then began its slow, surgical build-up. Sophia learned the mechanics of his life. She learned his passwords in the way she learned the tilt of his smile, through attentive, repeated closeness. She did not take the main account. She took the ones that were easy to dry up, the commission accounts, the modest savings set aside for travel, the emergency fund he'd accumulated with the cautious generosity of someone who had once believed his own future. She did it in ways that never felt like theft. "We should put this in a joint account," she suggested, and he agreed because he loved her. "I'll manage it, I'm good at this stuff," she said, and he, who had once burned out caring for others, accepted relief in place of control. Parallel to this, she began to erode Daniel's support structures. She was not crude about it, she was strategic. Friends who questioned her would find themselves met with an explanation that sounded like self-defense dressed as candor. She hinted that some of Daniel's old friends were jealous, that they didn't like the fact he'd found someone who cared for him. She encouraged him to spend less time at galleries where small politics reigned and more time at private dinners where sealing the meal with a signature was easier than pointing out inconsistencies. She suggested he accept a lucrative contract from a corporate client that would occupy his time and bring cash up front, one that required immediate sign-offs and payments handled through personal accounts. He agreed, thinking he was being practical and romantic all at once. Daniel's colleagues noticed change. He was less present at exhibit openings. His once bold series of public works became smaller commission pieces, but the shift never looked like sabotage. It looked like compromise, like a man moving through life toward stability. Sophia made him feel as if their future was being built with bricks of small practicality. She made plans involving expensive frames and long trips he'd never have considered alone. Love dulled his instincts. Love made excuses for the missing receipts and the delayed reimbursements. He began to sign contracts without his usual lawyer, throwing himself on faith because he believed the woman who believed him. Sophia's ledger thickened. Her debts were not only invoices and late notices. They included favors owed to people with little patience, loans taken out under names that made tracking back nearly impossible. People who had helped her demanded returns with increasing impatience. Money with the ease of blood draws was needed now. The plan moved from opportunistic to deliberate. Leverage, she cultivated one more link. The old flame who had betrayed her, Leo, came into town on business. Sophia used him as an occasional puppet without the messy drama of rekindling romance. She baited conversations he couldn't refuse because he loved the illusion of control. When Leo boasted, Sophia catalogued the names of his new partners and the firms he'd joined, and she mapped how to extract money indirectly through contracts and corporate windows he could open and forget. It was messy, illegal in places she ignored, and it required a moral distillation she performed in private. The dismantling of Daniel's life accelerated, but it was always staged like care. More private commissions, a suggested business partner that came with plausible credentials, a buyer for a few paintings who paid a fraction up front and promised the rest. She arranged for him to accept a fast-moving contract while she handled the invoices. She promised to clear up a tax technicality and persuaded him to sign forms granting her temporary access. She told him she was proud of him for being practical, that this would get them to a place where neither of them ever had to look over their shoulder again. And then came the small betrayals that changed lives. The emergency fund disappeared after a supposedly urgent payment for a property she'd found that would net them rental income. The corporate client delayed crucial payments. She smoothed it over with a loan she later called a favor. Friends who might have intervened found themselves distracted by half-truths and subtle rumors about Daniel's reliability. A critic who had once loved Daniel's public series wrote a cutting review after being fed an anonymous tip about plagiarism. A buyer cancelled a sale because a conflict of interest allegedly came to light. Each scene could be explained by the rough arithmetic of the city. None of them, taken alone, pointed at Sophia. Taken together, they wove a tightening net. Daniel noticed shadows. He saw thinner months and a friendless calendar, but he always found explanation in the soft features of the woman who cooked for him, who held his head when the nights were hard, who asked for nothing dramatic. He believed in the domestic tenderness she staged, and in the shelter of it, his last defenses dissolved. He did not watch the ledger she kept, the small notepad she slid into a novel tucked on the shelf. He did not see the names inked there with patient practicality. Sophia, for all her resolve, had moments of reflection that looked like guilt. Sometimes, when Daniel slept, she watched the curve of his face and found herself staring at a man who had once been whole, kind, and quick to forgive. There were flickers where she imagined telling him everything and letting him help her pay her way back to safety by honest means. But each flicker was extinguished by a cold calculation. Honesty would mean setting limits she could not abide. If she told Daniel, he would help, but he would then keep the old friends and the old life she wanted to erase. He would be back to being the man who trusted too much and who would never, she decided, build the kind of armor she needed. In this cruel logic, she hardened into purpose. The plan culminated when Sophia persuaded Daniel to sell a portfolio of pieces to cover a temporary shortfall. He sold the works he cherished most, Knights and Bridges, People in Amber Light. She praised his courage and promise of a trip with money in hand. The money did not go into the trip. It went into accounts manipulated by intermediaries she'd vetted and into paying off the debt collectors who would stop calling only if funds changed hands. She then moved funds through a chain of accounts designed to be messy, to look like poorly executed freelance transfers rather than deliberate theft. At the same time, she took measures to ensure he could not easily rebuild. She leaked a rumor, anonymous messages to a few small galleries, alleging that Daniel had accepted work under false names. She pushed gently, through carefully phrased doubt, the idea that his best public works had been done in collaboration with a past partner no longer in the city. It was enough to make patrons hesitate and galleries slow to respond. Daniel's reputation, which had been built on quiet kindness and an eye for truth, frayed in the edges. In the final, most terrible move, the removal of Daniel's safety net. He had a mother, a single woman who loved him with the blunt, persistent love of a parent. She lived a train ride away and called weekly, but Sophia subtly disentangled their communication. Calls came at odd hours. She offered to accompany Daniel to see his mother and then turned the visit into a hurried drop. By that left no time for long conversations. She became his world in ways that felt warm and necessary. Without an external check, Daniel was increasingly vulnerable. With the access she now had, Sophia could arrange for funds to be redirected, for deposits to be used for urgent repairs, for invoices to be paid with money that belonged elsewhere. Each action was framed as rescue. The night he disappeared was ordinary in all the ways that make ordinary things dangerous. They had dinner with friends, a quiet meal at home. Daniel talked about an opportunity to travel to a neighboring city for a small residency. He wanted to take the trip to finish a series. To step out again into the world he had retreated from. Sophia smiled and said, "It's perfect. Go finish it. I'll keep the home fires burning." She pressed a small amount of cash into his hand, a gesture that felt like a blessing. He left on the first damp morning of spring, a knapsack on his shoulder, the city just waking. He kissed her in the doorway, the way a man kisses someone he means to return to, and she watched him go with a face that was calm as a closed door. The days that followed were a drill of unease. He did not call. Texts went unanswered. Daniel's mother grew worried and asked Sophia for details. Sophia sent polite reassurances, train delays, wrong connections, a terrible hotel. She suggested it might be fine to wait 48 hours. It always is, she said, when you're concerned. When 2 days passed, she offered to check with the residency. When 3 days passed, she posted a picture on social media of a cafe she said was where she last spoke to him. The farther away she made him seem, the less derivative suspicion landed on her. When the worst news came, Daniel's body found under a bridge outside the city, A night of rain washing the world clean, the city called it an accident. There was no conclusive trauma, no note, nothing to tell a neat tale. People whispered about a misstep, a wrong footing on a slick parapet. The police labeled it undetermined, which is to say the explanation had weight, but not the shape of justice. For friends, the disaster was a storm with an impossible center. For Sophia, the news landed like a calculation completed and then set aside. She unfurled a face of grief practiced enough to be convincing. Public tears, a memorably sad statement of disbelief, a funeral speech shaped like devotion. But in private, her ledger marked the last column. The transfers she'd arranged had been executed while Daniel was away, using documents she had pressed into his hand in the weeks before. Signatures he had given had freed pathways for funds to move through accounts and into hers. The chain she'd created was intricate. Third-party trusts, shell companies, small payments routed through freelance handles. It was legal in grey ways, illegal in others, but designed so that prosecuting it would require an appetite for forensic patience she did not expect anyone to have. The accounts emptied, the debt collectors smoked the stub of their anger, and the people who had threatened her were paid. She boarded a bus 3 days after the funeral with a single suitcase and the quiet calculation of someone who had completed what she had set out to do. The discovery of the manipulation came slowly. Friends became detectives, skimming bank statements and receipts with the desperate focus of those who have lost something irreplaceable. Daniel's mother pored through paperwork that was written in his careful hand. They found odd withdrawals, transfers to names she did not know, payees with addresses in other states. A few transactions pointed toward the small company Sophia had recommended, but the trail kept splintering into plausible deniability. She had a lawyer, a friend who provided receipts stamped in convincing type. She had left the city with no obvious trace. Rumors hardened into suspicions. People talked behind hands, at galleries, on corners where he had once stood with a coffee and a sketchbook. A few of his close friends confronted her at the funeral and by the graveside. She nodded with the right look, haunted, shocked, grief-struck. Her answers were engineered to be true in all the wrong ways. A shared bank, a loan under duress, legal agreements he had signed. She pointed to a set of documents showing that he had authorized transfers, the very signatures he'd made in trust, and said, "I only did what he asked." It was a bitter, simple defense that smelled of calculation. The police investigated. They called her in for questioning more than once. They found the chain of transfers, the shell accounts, the payments to debt collectors, and a small list of people who had benefited from the move. They found interviews where she had painted herself as his devoted partner. They found her suitcase, later, filled with new clothes and an application for a small business license in a town 3 hours away. But they did not find the smoking gun, no recorded confession, no single unmistakable direction from her to take the money outright. The case became a tangle of intent and plausible explanation, and in the city bureaucracy mysteries thicken into fog. Sophia lived in a town of white clapboard houses afterward. She opened a small shop selling curated home goods and commissioned portraits. She used the funds she'd taken to smooth the edges of her new life. A tidy business license, a lawyer who structured income so it seemed legitimate, a custody of cash that made people think, at worst, she was clever and perhaps lucky. She paid back the most insistent of her former creditors and washed her trail with plausible income. In her new mirror, she saw the face of a woman who had traded moral chaos for tidy nights. Sometimes, at 3 in the morning, she would wake and see Daniel's face like a photograph on a mantle, a man who had loved generously and been brought low, and a wash of something like sorrow passed through her. It never lasted long. For Daniel's friends, life was a long season of grief and rage. They demanded examinations of every transfer, lobbied the police for a deeper review, hired a forensic accountant with money scraped together from selling possessions and holding a small benefit sale of his remaining works. The accountant traced funds into the shell structures, into an account that on paper belonged to a small consultancy in another state. From there, the money branched out into ways that made legal recourse difficult. The police exhorted patience, while lawyers filed motions. Grief gave way to the slow, exhausted determination of those who have lost someone and want one answer. Rumors of Sophia's responsibility hardened into a community story. People saw her in the clapboard town and judged her with the clarity of the hurt. She had used a man who trusted her until he had nothing left. They watched her shop like vultures watching a carcass. But gossip is not a court. It does not convict. It does not take back the things she had taken. It does not sit in the place where a mother's arms should be. The law, slow and constrained by proof, never quite caught up to the moral shape of what had happened. In time, memory dulled the outrage for some, and the city resumed its regular motion. The bridge where Daniel's body had been found gained a plaque from the local arts council in his honor, a small, imperfect consolation. A gallery opened a retrospective of his early work. People who had ignored his talent for convenience now lined up to buy his framed pieces from the estate. His mother kept the small, imperfect portraits of breakfast plates and the sketches he had drawn on napkins. She catalogued them with the love of someone who refuses to let an absence become all-consuming. Sophia's life, for all its surface coherence, contained a private ledger she could not trash. Money bought convenience and safety and a small business. It did not buy back the gentle things Daniel had given her, the warmth of being loved by someone who made room for others, the casual kindness that would have freed her from the need to plan every step with cold calculation. In deep nights she would sometimes dream of him, not as enemy or victim, but as a man who had been generous to his own demise. Those dreams lasted seconds and left peculiar smells, coffee and turpentine. The ending was not cinematic. It was not blood in the street or a confession shouted under streetlight. It was a series of small movements that added up to a quiet catastrophe. Daniel's life unraveled, finances drained, friendships eroded, opportunities that might have saved him lost, until he was walking alone on a high bridge one night, the wet street reflecting lights like broken mirrors. The city called it an accident. The coroner said undetermined. His friends never stopped asking for truth. Sophia achieved what she had set out to do. She paid off the looming threats that had haunted her and purchased a level of freedom that felt like victory. Yet the victory was small against the weight of what it required. She had traded the life of a man who loved her for the currency that buys a quieter kind of safety. She had fashioned in quiet rooms and careful transfers a freedom she had vowed to obtain. And in the deep hours of the night, when the shop lights were off and the town her new home, she would sometimes stand by the window and watch the rain pattern the glass in the way she used to watch Daniel sketch water. She kept the notepad where she had recorded his passwords in a copy of a book she never read. She kept the receipts in a shoebox beneath a shelf. The story closed in a tenderness and a cruelty entwined. Daniel's friends would bury him and clench the knowledge of his last months like a coal in their fists. Sophia would build a life arranged on accounts and quiet nights. The law would hum with investigation that never wholly resolved into indictment. The moral lines, who had the right to take, who had the right to forgive, blurred until every answer felt partial. In the end, tragedy remained stubbornly ordinary. People who had loved Daniel told stories that turned him into a constellation of small truths, a laugh, a sketch, a kindness, while others debated whether the dark arithmetic that had eroded him was a product of cruelty or necessity. Sophia lived on with money and a shop, and a name that people muttered when they passed her window. She had what she wanted, but the price was a life she had been part of dismantling from the inside out.